Your grandfather was nothing but a dirt-poor squatter. That is the sentence that Vanessa Sterling shrieked at my grandfather's funeral, her voice cutting through the solemn silence of the cemetery like a serrated knife hitting bone, while the casket of the greatest man I ever knew was still hovering above the 6-foot drop. Imagine the scene, the heavy gray sky of late October hanging low over us, the scent of damp earth and white lilies filling the air, and there she is, this 50-something woman in a neon lime power suit that looked radioactive against the autumn leaves, stomping through the mud in designer heels, pointing a manicured, plastic talon right between my eyes. She wasn't grieving. She was demanding the deed to the 900 acres of prime, untouched earth that Silas Caldwell had just left me. She called a Vietnam veteran, a man who built his life with calloused hands and a spine of steel, a squatter at his own burial. And in that moment, as the rain started to mist against my face, hiding the tears I refused to let fall, I knew she had just made the last mistake of her miserable, plastic life. Silas didn't just leave me a farm. He left me a loaded gun in the form of legal paperwork, a nuclear option designed to vaporize greedy parasites. But before I tell you how I burned her world to the ground, you need to understand the stakes. My name is Mason Caldwell. I'm 34, a remote systems architect who spent the last decade staring at screens in a shoebox apartment, living for the weekends when I could drive up to Oak Haven Valley and sit on the porch with the man who raised me. Silas took me in when I was 8, after my folks died on the interstate, and he was built like the ancient oak trees he loved, rough bark on the outside, solid timber on the inside, smelling perpetually of pipe tobacco and engine grease. The inheritance hit me like a freight train. I honestly thought he'd leave the land to the state or a trust, but the lawyer, a sharp-eyed old wolf named Atticus Thorne, slid the papers across the mahogany desk and told me I was now the sole owner of a kingdom, 400 acres of hardwood timber worth a fortune, 300 of pasture, and 200 surrounding the homestead where Silas had waged a 40-year war against nature and the banks. We are talking nearly $3 million of assets, owned free and clear, no mortgage, no liens, just pure legacy. I spent the first week walking the fence lines, running my hands over the surveyor maps Silas kept in his chaotic office, feeling the weight of history, the ghost of his laughter in the creaking floorboards of the farmhouse kitchen. Then came the invasion, slithering out of the manicured nightmare next door known as Willow Creek Estates. Vanessa Sterling had moved into the biggest McMansion in that soulless subdivision 3 years ago, a monstrosity of faux marble columns and a garage big enough to house a blimp. And within 6 months, she had crowned herself the HOA queen because literally no one else had the energy to fight her wine-drunk tyranny. From her deck, sipping Chardonnay at 10 a.m., she didn't see a farm. She saw a golf course. She saw a spa. She saw the expansion phase of her suburban delusions. The day after the funeral, while I'm still learning how to operate the ancient boiler in the basement, this woman files a formal complaint with the county, alleging that Silas's will was coerced, demanding a probate freeze, claiming that a city boy like me was unfit to manage agricultural zoning. She didn't stop there. She planted a story in the Oak Haven Gazette hinting that I was secretly planning to sell the land to a chemical waste disposal company, scaring the locals into thinking their groundwater was about to turn into battery acid. She Googled how to seize abandoned farmland on the public library computer, forgetting that our librarian, Mrs. Higgins, has the eyes of a hawk and the gossip network of the KGB, sending screenshots of Vanessa's search history to half the town before Vanessa even left the building. But her fatal flaw was arrogance. She looked at me and saw a soft IT guy in a hoodie, someone she could bully into submission with scary legal letters and social pressure. She didn't know that Silas Caldwell hadn't just taught me how to rotate crops. He taught me how to fight an insurgency. He survived the jungles of Vietnam and decades of government bureaucrats trying to steal his water rights. And he had prepared for this exact moment, turning his filing cabinets into a fortress of documentation. Standing in that kitchen, watching the rain blur the view of the valley, I made a promise to the empty room that not 1 inch of this dirt would ever belong to a woman who thought rustic meant buying distressed furniture at a high-end mall. Vanessa's opening salvo was a lawsuit freezing my assets, blocking me from selling, developing, or even logging a single tree, locking up my inheritance tighter than a bank vault. I sat there in my pajamas, holding the injunction delivered by a sheriff's deputy who looked apologetic, listening to the silence of the house, and I could feel her victory lap, imagining the click of her heels on the courthouse floor. But I remembered Silas's voice, gravelly and calm, telling me, "Mason, never fire until you see the whites of their eyes, and always know what they're standing on." So, I went to the courthouse and paid $47 for a stack of public records regarding the Willow Creek Estates HOA and their original development filings. What I found was pure gold, a paper trail that revealed Vanessa had been coordinating with a shadowy entity called Apex Horizon Group for years, plotting to acquire our land to secure water access for a luxury expansion. But buried in the dusty archives of the county clerk's office was something she missed, a 1964 water rights permit that Silas had framed in his mind but never bragged about. In the West, water law is simple: first in time, first in right. Our well didn't just supply the farm. It sat on the aquifer that fed the entire subdivision's aesthetic ponds and irrigation systems, and Silas's senior rights meant I could legally turn off the tap to her precious neighborhood if I wanted to irrigate my corn. I called her that night, my voice sweet as molasses, and dropped the bomb, telling her, "Hey neighbor, just reviewing some old permits. Turns out your entire golf course dream is dependent on my grandfather's 1964 water claim, which legally takes precedence over your sprinklers." The silence on the other end was heavy, suffocating, until I heard the distinct sound of a wine glass shattering, followed by a dial tone. She thought it was a negotiation. She didn't realize it was a siege, and I was just getting started. Vanessa Sterling didn't take the hint. She took it as a declaration of total war, launching a scorched earth campaign that made her previous attempts look like child's play. Within 24 hours, the internet was flooded with bot-generated reviews claiming my farm was a breeding ground for rabid coyotes, and she flooded the county lines with noise complaints about my rooster, General Tso, crowing at dawn, in a farming district where roosters have been waking people up since the invention of sunrise. She weaponized the bureaucracy, sending inspectors to measure the distance of my fence posts, checking for code violations on a barn that was built before codes existed, trying to bleed me dry with fines and fees. But she forgot that small towns run on two things: coffee and loyalty. Elias Vance, the editor of the local paper and Silas's Tuesday chess partner, smelled the rot immediately. When Vanessa tried to plan a story about me running a meth lab in the root cellar, Elias started digging into her past instead. Meanwhile, Mabel, who runs the diner where Silas ate breakfast every single day for 30 years, turned her back booth into an intelligence-gathering post, writing down every time Vanessa met with suits from the city, tracking who she was bribing with corporate credit cards. I decided to fight fire with high-definition surveillance, installing military-grade trail cameras all along the property line, disguised in birdhouses and hollow logs. It didn't take long to catch the predator in her natural habitat. At 2 a.m., the cameras picked up a pink SUV idling at my north gate, and there she was, Vanessa, stumbling around in the dark with a flashlight, photographing my water troughs, my compost piles, looking for anything she could spin into an environmental hazard. But then, the footage caught something that made my blood run cold. She was dumping gallons of paint thinner into Whispering Brook, the creek that runs through my land, and into the county reservoir, actively poisoning the water so she could report me for contamination. I wanted to call the cops right then, to drag her out of her mansion in cuffs, but Atticus Thorne, my lawyer, put a hand on my shoulder and told me to wait. "Let her dig the hole deeper, Mason," he said, his eyes gleaming behind wire-rimmed glasses. "We want a burial, not a slap on the wrist." Then came the financial gut punch. A reassessment notice from the county tax assessor, valuing my luxury resort potential land at a rate that slapped me with a $47,000 tax bill, due in 60 days or face foreclosure. I nearly threw up on the kitchen floor until I found Silas's "in case of emergency" folder, which contained a stamped, verified veteran's homestead exemption he'd filed in the 80s but never used, a shield that capped property tax increases for combat veterans' families, instantly dropping the bill to a manageable $3,000. While I was dodging tax bullets, I hired Declan O'Malley, a private investigator who looks like he sleeps in his car and smells like stale donuts but can find a needle in a digital haystack. Declan came back 3 days later with a dossier that would make a con artist blush. Vanessa Sterling didn't exist. She was actually Vanessa St. Clair, a grifter from Oklahoma with a rap sheet of bankruptcy fraud and identity theft across 3 states, a woman who specialized in targeting elderly landowners, partnering with shady developers to force sales, and then vanishing with the commission. But the real twist, the thing that changed the game from a property dispute to a criminal conspiracy, was what Declan found in the financial records of Apex Horizon Group. They had already sold $80 million worth of pre-construction condos on my land, taking deposits from investors for units that didn't exist, on land they didn't own, banking everything on the assumption that Vanessa could bully me into selling cheap. She wasn't just annoying, she was desperate, owing millions in personal guarantees, leveraging a lifestyle she couldn't afford on a gamble that was rapidly falling apart. And then, I found the nuke. I was cleaning out Silas's pantry, knocking over a tin of old recipe cards, when a yellowed, folded document slipped out from behind a recipe for apple pie. It was a perpetual agricultural preservation pact dated 1964, a covenant Silas had signed with the State Conservation Board. It stated clearly, in black and white, that if any owner ever attempted to rezone the land for commercial or residential use, the title would automatically revert to the State Department of Parks and Wildlife for $0. Silas had rigged the land to self-destruct if anyone ever tried to turn it into a golf course. Vanessa was trying to force a rezoning to build her resort, and in doing so, she was literally building the legal case to hand the land over to the state for free, wiping out her investors and leaving her with millions in debt and no asset. But she didn't know I had the document. She escalated again, and this time, it got violent. My cameras picked up 3 guys with crowbars trying to break into the equipment barn, scattering like roaches when I racked Silas's shotgun on the porch. 2 nights later, I woke up to the smell of gasoline and saw flames licking the side of the historic barn. She had tried to torch the place to claim I was committing insurance fraud. I put out the fire with the help of Red, a local mechanic and old war buddy of Silas, who showed up with half the VFW chapter before the fire trucks even arrived. We saved the structure, but the scorched wood was the final straw. Vanessa had tried to burn down my grandfather's legacy. It was time to stop playing defense. It was time to invite her to her own execution. We set the trap at the county commission meeting, an event usually attended by 3 people sleeping in the back row, but this time, thanks to the whisper network of Mabel and Mrs. Higgins, the room was packed to the rafters. Vanessa walked in wearing huge sunglasses and a wig that looked like a dead animal, trying to blend in, but you could smell the fear rolling off her like cheap perfume. She thought this meeting was a formality to approve her zoning petition, the final step before she could pave over my memories. The corrupt official, Inspector Graves, banged his gavel and asked if there were any objections to the Willow Creek expansion project. Atticus Thorne stood up, smoothing his suit jacket, and said, "Actually, we have a few visuals to share." The projector screen dropped, and suddenly, the entire town was watching 4K footage of Vanessa dumping chemicals into the creek, bribing Inspector Graves with a thick envelope in the parking lot of the diner, and stumbling away from my burning barn with a gas can in her hand. The sound of the gasps in the room sucked the oxygen right out of the air. Vanessa shot up, screaming, "This is fake. This is AI generated. That squatter doesn't know how to use a computer." She was unraveling, pointing a shaking finger at me, confessing her crimes in real time by trying to justify them. "I have investors. I have $80 million on the line. You can't do this to me." And that's when Atticus displayed the 1964 covenant. He explained, calmly, "Even if you weren't going to prison for arson and fraud, Mrs. St. Clair, this land can never be yours. The moment you filed for rezoning, you triggered the state's conservation clause. The development is legally impossible." The doors at the back of the hall swung open, and federal agents, who had been briefed by Declan, marched in. I watched through the chaos as Vanessa's face went from red to a ghostly, sickly white. They slapped the cuffs on her right there in front of the town council, the local news cameras flashing like lightning. Inspector Graves tried to sneak out the side door, but ran right into a U.S. Marshal. As they dragged Vanessa out, kicking and screaming about her rights and her property values, I stood up and met her eyes one last time. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just nodded, a silent message from Silas. Get off my land. The fallout was spectacular. Vanessa St. Clair, got 5 years in federal prison for wire fraud, arson, and environmental crimes. Apex Horizon Group collapsed under the weight of the investigation, and the investors sued them into oblivion. The Willow Creek Estates HOA, horrified by the revelation that their president was a crook who was actively poisoning their water supply, voted to dissolve and petition for annexation into the new conservation district we created. 6 months later, I'm sitting on the porch swing, drinking coffee from Silas's chipped mug. The barn has been repaired and converted into the Silas Caldwell Memorial Reserve, a center for teaching sustainable farming to local kids and a retreat for veterans with PTSD. We established a scholarship fund with the timber money, sending the sons and daughters of farmers to college debt-free. Mabel brings apple pie over on Sundays, and Red helps me keep the tractors running. I look out over the valley, the mist rising off the green hills, knowing that this land is protected forever, not just by a piece of paper, but by a community that refused to let greed win. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? In a world where everyone is trying to pave paradise and put up a parking lot, is justice something the law gives you? Or is it something you have to forge yourself, with patience, a good camera, and a grandfather's ghost watching your back? Drop a comment below if you think Vanessa got off too easy, and don't forget to like and subscribe for the next story. You won't believe what happened when a corrupt mayor tried to eminent domain a food truck park. Was 5 years enough for someone who tried to burn down a veteran's legacy and steal $80 million? Or does the justice system still favor the white-collar criminals? Let me know your verdict.